Welcome back to our students. I'm Mr. Martinez,
Mr. Santiago here.
and this is History Talks. If you don't remember, History Talks are your pre-recorded lectures in world history that have been put together in a nice Edpuzzle for you that you can watch at any time, as many times as you need. The only thing that the Edpuzzle is going to make you do, of course, is actually follow along with the lecture and also responding to the questions that are embedded in the video. And lastly, taking some small notes at the very end. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a huge topic ahead of us today. It is the last one when coming along with the conversation of World War II, which is the Holocaust, the final solution. We are going to try to understand what this is, why it happened, and all that is included with it. There is a quick recap we need to do just so that we understand the story and where this fits in the time of history that we've been focusing on.
So the quick recap, guys, is anti-Semitism, the targeting and persecution of Jewish people. See, Jewish people have been targeted and discriminated against long before the Holocaust. So this isn't new. So Hitler's rise to power. During Hitler's rise to power, he often targeted Jewish people, and he blamed them for what was going on in Germany. You guys remember that? Why World War I? Why did Germany lose World War I? Well, according to Hitler, they lost because it was the Jewish people's fault. The Holocaust and the battles of World War II were happening simultaneously at the same time, and the Allied powers knew about the Holocaust, although they didn't know how bad it was until the end. So you guys are going to learn about that, how we knew that it was going on, but we had no idea how bad it was. So the history standards, guys, that we're going to be focusing on, that we want you guys to learn, is you guys are going to analyze the Nazi policy of pursuing racial purity, especially against the European Jews. So what does this racial purity mean, right? Racial purity, it's the cleansing of the Jews. We want only the Nazi party, only German blood to be around, right? That's the mentality of Hitler's Nazi party. So you got, especially against the European Jews, it's transformation into the final solution, and the Holocaust that resulted in the murder of 6 million Jewish civilians. The essential question: can you identify the origins of anti-Semitism and identify the effects of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany?
Perfect. So not only, of course, are we going to understand the Holocaust, but the terminology that comes along with it, like that word anti-Semitism. Mr. Santiago, I have a quick question for you. When we talk history, sometimes it's easy for us to think that it's so far in the past. Let's kind of clear the room. How long ago was this Holocaust, when there was essentially this death machine created to eliminate who were deemed undesirables? How long ago was this?
So let's look at this time map that we have right here, right? So if you look at 1935, that's the Nazi party taking control of Germany. Then in 1945, the end of World War II, right? And Martin Luther King was in 1963. We have the Armstrong landing on the moon in 69, Vietnam War, and then Michael Jordan, the argument, right? I know most of you guys are arguing that LeBron James is the GOAT. Well, Michael Jordan is still being talked about, but that doesn't seem so long ago. 1984, look at here. The 1980s, in between 84 and 97, Mr. Martinez, myself, and Miss Garcia were born. So it's not that ancient. Harry Potter was published in 1997, 9/11, which you guys will learn about more next year, happened in 2001. Then the iPhone, released in 2007, then you guys were all born. So when you guys look at this, it wasn't too long ago. A lot of times we think about, why do we study all this? Why does it matter? Because we want to learn from it, and the fact that it wasn't too long ago, guys. And some of this stuff is even trickling and still happening today. So we're going to look at Hitler and his Nazi party. Who did he target? He targeted the Romanian people, right? Jewish people, anyone that wasn't of German blood, right? So you have the LGBTQ community and any other undesirable, that's who he targeted. He really wanted an ethnic cleansing. He really wanted a pure white Aryan German race. So if you weren't that, you would be a target.
Absolutely. And not only would it be based on your heritage or your racial identity. But if you were a friend to one of these people who were targeted, you would also be considered locked up. The way you would look would be enough. If not that, how you acted in society, if you were against the Nazi government, you would find yourselves to be a target and in these camps as well.
So we're going to look at the Allied power advance. So if you go to the bottom of the left of the screen, you see that Nazis take control of Germany. Then you have the Nuremberg laws that kick in 1935. Then 1938, you have the Evian Conference. You're moving up to phase one of the final solution of 1941. This is when the Allied nations become aware of what's going on in the camps. And then you have the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1942. Then the War Refugee Board is created in 1944. Then finally, in 1945, Germany surrenders.
So those are a lot of the things we're going to be talking about and focusing on in today's lesson when it comes to the Holocaust. But let's go ahead and try to make sure we understand what that word anti-Semitism is, right? We're going to be using that word a lot today, but don't get it confused with what it really is. Anti-Semitism is essentially the hostilities and prejudice against Jewish people, the discrimination of these particular people. And like Mr. Santiago said, this has been happening for thousands of years. Jewish people have been, throughout world history, kind of been the targeted group for a lot of the problems that happen in society, and largely just because of them being different than the other communities that they would be associated with. When we say Jewish, we're meaning any person belonging to a worldwide group that constitutes and descends a continuation of the ancient Jewish people who themselves are the disciples, I'm sorry, not disciples, but the descendants of Hebrews of the Bible. So these people do come from a long time of our ancient history who have been around for many times. And during this, it is largely a religious group community that has a widespread diversity, okay? Now, when we talk about anti-Semitism, there are multiple acts of it. How are these Jewish people being discriminated by? Like, how is it done? Well, throughout history, it's been the case that they've been either segregated into ghettos, like in the Middle Ages. They've been denied citizenship or protection of citizenship from countries. They've been typically accused of money laundering and money corruption. They've been also blamed for a lot of immigration issues. So throughout history, these are the main themes of acts of anti-Semitism that have existed then and now within history.
So genocide. What is genocide? It's the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. So let's take a look at some examples of genocide throughout our history. So first and foremost, there was a massacre of indigenous people of North and South America, the Native Americans. I'm sure you guys all learned that back in elementary. The Zanzar massacre, the ethnic cleansing of Circassia, the Armenian genocide, and what we're going to look at today, the Holocaust. So the Armenian genocide, this was the systematic killing and deportation of Armenians by the Turks of the Ottoman Empire. So when the massacres and deportations finally ended, between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians were dead.
Wow.
And they were only targeted because why? They were Armenian, and there was an ethnic cleansing going on by the Turks of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah. Mr. Santiago, quick question. 1.5 million Armenians were executed in that genocide. How many are we talking about in this genocide of the Holocaust?
It's definitely more. I think we're close up to what, 10, 15?
Yeah, the estimates are wide range, between 6 to 10 million. So we're talking about a even more gruesome genocide that happened before this one of the Armenian.
So just to give you guys perspective, he just said 6 to 10 million. There's about 10 million people in the city of Los Angeles. So When you're driving over the Grapevine and you're passing Six Flags, imagine seeing no people from Six Flags all the way through Disneyland. That's how many people were just wiped out. So in 1914, the Turks entered World War I on the side of Germany and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And at the same time, Ottoman religious authorities declared a holy war against all Christians except their allies. So what did the Turkish government? Well, they don't acknowledge the scope of these events. They don't give it its importance to this day.
So there's one thing of us talking about anti-Semitism. There is another when you witness it on video. There is recordings of these acts of anti-Semitism and how it started to rise in European societies, more importantly in Nazi Germany. And we're going to see how the discrimination slowly starts and how it becomes quickly out of hand with this video. Perfect. Thank you guys so much for watching that video. And thank you guys for understanding a little bit of the graphic nature of it, because unfortunately, acts of violence is not a PG rated thing. It is an atrocity. It is something that is terrible. But within history, we do see it with our own eyes and how it plays out.
So a quick checkpoint, considering what we just went over in the video, what are some examples of acts of anti-Semitism and genocide? One more time, guys, what are some examples of acts of anti-Semitism and genocide?
Answer that now before you're able to continue. Perfect. Thank you so much for doing that. Let's go ahead and continue with our lesson. Now focusing a little bit more on that development of anti-Semitism that started to make into policy within Nazi Germany. There's one thing when hate crimes and hate speech are illegal. What happens when they become legal? When the society is allowed to discriminate against a group of people? Well, this is what we're going to be talking about next. There's 3 different events that happen that show that policy of hate being more legal in Germany. One of them being the Nuremberg laws, which deprived Jews of German citizenship and placed severe restrictions on them. They were prohibited from marrying non-Jews, attending or teaching at German schools or universities, holding any kind of government jobs, practicing law or medicine, or publishing books. Essentially, you see a straight cancel culture within the Jewish community where people are now losing their jobs, not allowed to go to school, not allowed to get married because of who they are. They have their citizenship stripped away. This leads to more violence with an infamous event that happened. The English version of it is the Night of Broken Glass. And what happened in 1938 was Nazi mobs in Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia smashed the windows of Jewish homes and businesses. The people in these societies believe in this hate propaganda and act on it and do mob violence and attacking all Jewish homes, all Jewish businesses, all Jewish churches, and eliminating them. 1,000 synagogues or churches were burned and more than 7,000 Jews' businesses were destroyed. People are being attacked. And this is all because of that German culture, this idea of purifying Germany. This was super thick propaganda, folks. People were trained to hate. It was real and it started young. Hitler youth indoctrinated the Nazi rhetoric, pledged absolute loyalty to Germany, and undertook physical fitness programs to prepare the children for war. Not only for them to believe this ideology, but to even get them ready to be a weapon within it. Nazis, of course, did use lots of education, lots of books, lots of media manipulation so that people would actually believe this propaganda when they're told that Jewish people are subhuman and therefore do not deserve human accommodations.
You said education, Mr. Martinez. What do you mean? That they would teach that to them in school?
Absolutely. Imagine if a textbook you had to open And it told you this propaganda saying there is a master race and it is this. Everyone else is totally not the master race and is just a servant for this one. You would have to answer that question right on your pop quiz for, for you to be able to move on in class. That's how level of propaganda, right? Where the facts you're being told aren't even real.
So quick checkpoint, guys. And we just heard it, so we hope you were paying attention. How did the Nazis treat Jewish people within cities? So how did the Nazis treat Jewish people within cities?
Perfect. Thank you so much for responding to that. There were so many examples you could look at and point to from that one. So let's see that development of policy of hate grow even further. You're going to see that Hitler starts to create a campaign for his idea of purifying his society. And it's called the final solution. Final solutions, very ominous, very notorious, even within its naming. And there's a few different phases to it. The final solution campaign started in 1941. This was when the Nazis started to plan how to eradicate Jewish people and those who they deemed undesirable, how to exterminate them. And they start to do it slowly, and then they started to become very aggressive with it. First was segregation. They segregated Jews into the ghettos, into the bad parts of the cities, cramming anyone who identified as Jewish to be forced into this only one spot of the city. Other things started to happen, like deportation. After they were put into the ghettos, there was starting to be this idea of getting rid of them or liquidating. So they started to deport Jewish people by force to places that they were told they were going to be relocated or resettled, which unfortunately was a lie, as these camps were not resettlement camps or refugee camps, but rather death camps. The first phase of the final solution was a little messy. And what I mean by that is that the camps weren't necessarily assembled just yet. The first phase was more this idea that you have your mobile killing squad that goes behind your basic military. And after you conquer some new land, these killing squads would go through the city and town, find anyone that the German people don't like who are on their list, and they would exterminate them right there on the streets. This happened for a few years, and you'll notice that mostly in Soviet Union, these murdering, killing units would go through, and they did exterminate about 1 million men, women, and children in Eastern Europe on their own. 1 million sounds like a lot, right? Well, to Hitler, it wasn't enough. He said that that was not efficient enough. It wasn't quick enough to kill them, and that he needed a more factory system to be able to make it more efficient. That's where you see the second phase of the final solution start to come through, with 6 death camps created in these new territories that he owns, like Poland and other Eastern European areas. This is going to be a site where many of people will find their end, as this death machine is relentless on how they try to exterminate people systematically.
A quick checkpoint, guys. What was the final solution and how did it work? So what was the final solution and how did it work?
Perfect. Thank you so much for doing that. So let's talk about those actual concentration camps. Once these Jewish people and undesirables were forced into these trains, these cattle trains, and transported to concentration camps, what were these concentration camps like? What were their conditions? What did they have to do? Well, reaching the camp was already, like I mentioned, a terrible journey. When people were being deported, they were being forced into cattle carts, cattle trains, literally train boxes designed to push cows and other kind of animals into, but now being used for humans. Once they reached the camp, they would be stripped of all their possessions, even though the Nazis said, take all your prized possessions with you out of the ghetto. It was merely only so that the Nazis could steal it from you once in the camp, as you are stripped of anything you once had. And you are shaved of your head, you have to wear these striped clothes, and you are now tattooed with a number that is now your official name. Whatever your name was before is no longer. This was done not only to men, but women and children and anyone and everyone who was deemed undesirable. The conditions of these camps were terrible. They're meant to try to make humans perish. So the conditions were meant to be terrible. These people were forced to work in these labor camps until they passed. And the Nazis lied to them even as they entered these camps, as there's a famous saying above the Auschwitz that says, "Work makes you free." The Jews were told and lied to even then that if you work hard, maybe you'll be free. But that lie soon becomes very obvious to the people when they see what other things they're doing to their prisoners. Besides the brutal mistreatment, the hunger, the disease, the executions, there's also medical experiments that they're going to be doing on them. Nazis test on children and adults and their prisoners on these gruesome things to see what is the human body capable of going through. Not to go in much details, but they experiment with many drugs, many diseases, and try to validate their racial idea that they're superior by examining the undesirables anatomy. You could imagine how intense it must have been for these people to go through this. And you must imagine what it must feel as an emotional toll for the people who survived this. You must imagine they must ask themselves every day, how is it that I made it out while many people didn't? Let's hear about these experiences from some survivors who have documented what it was like to be in these camps.
The human imagination still struggles to comprehend what was done here.
Perfect. Thank you so much for watching that, guys. And if you guys are getting the same emotions I am, it's totally understandable. That is a human emotion you're having because you are seeing people grieve about something that was traumatic during their lives.
So quick checkpoint, guys. What happened in the concentration camps? So what happened in the concentration camps?
Perfect. Let's continue.
The Jewish resistance, guys. So what happened after this? The Jewish people, they resisted the Nazis, even though they knew their efforts could not succeed. They tried. In the early 1940s, Jews in the ghettos of Eastern Europe at times took up arms. The largest uprising occurred in the Warsaw Ghetto in occupied Poland. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 1942, a major event. The Nazis began sending Polish Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka death camp to the slave labor camps. So by the spring of 1943, the German plan to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto was clear, and resistant groups planned a full-scale revolt. Armed with smuggled weapons and homemade bombs, the Jews took over the ghetto and prepared to fight to the end. So after holding out for a month, the resistance, the forces were crushed, guys. So the ghetto was in ruins and thousands were killed in the fighting. Any survivors were sent to the death camps or forced to labor camps. So even though it was doomed, this uprisings, this courage that the Jewish people had, it was happening in other places too. There was other uprisings. So one story is the escape. Some families are able to send their children abroad, to the United States and to non-Nazi occupied countries. Some children are hated or adopted by German families. Some other families were deported and they never saw their families again. So it was rough. You're talking about your 5 or 6 year old little brother. When this is going on, you might not see anymore, your parents. But they resisted, they tried, they fought.
Yeah, and I think something that we must point out and that we're going to see even following up with it is, yeah, when the word gets out about these death camps, how do the Allied powers respond? Do they take in as many people as they can to save them from these death camps? Are they dumbfounded and don't even believe it? That's what we should focus on next with this slide. Allies respond to the Holocaust. So we start to notice in 1938, in this conference of 32 countries, you start to see that they discuss these camps, but not as death camps or genocide yet. They deem it as refugee problems. And as they start to see a lot of Jewish people catching on to what is happening in Europe and are trying to flee in the masses. So these other countries have to figure out, what do we do? Do we take in all these rush of refugees, or do we say that's your problem? Well, you're going to find out there's a lot of different responses. Many countries refused or heavily limited the number of Jewish refugees allowed. So yes, some were able to escape, but the emphasis on is the sum. As many countries turned away these people, even with the rumors. You'll start to see in particular countries, they all respond differently, like Denmark and Bulgaria, who were able to save a lot of people, but places like United States and France weren't very efficient in trying to help these refugees, and rather force these ships to turn around that were full of refugees.
So a quick checkpoint. How did the Allies respond to the Holocaust? So how did the Allies respond to the Holocaust?
Perfect. That's right. Thank you so much for responding to that. So that was in the beginning. The Allies hear about this issue. They call it a refugee problem, not genocide, and they kind of help, but not all the way or really effectively. It isn't until the liberation of these camps is when these people will find some comfort and safety. These people struggled for 4 years with no one coming to their aid. And it wasn't until the liberation of the camps that you see that change. Liberation means that essentially the good guys, or in this circumstance, the good guys, are coming through and they find a camp and they deem it as theirs, right? They are freeing the people who are imprisoned there. They have gotten rid of the Nazis, and it is now under their control. So that's what we mean by liberation. So in 1940 to 1941 is when you start to see that there is this fight for helping out the Jewish resistance. It was a little bit, but not a lot, once again. Jewish resistance would call out to these countries, hey, help us out, there's things going on. And they might give some supplies, but they weren't able to commit, as a lot of these countries were afraid to interfere with their own military operations in Europe. It's not until 1943 that the Allies knew that the Jews were officially being taken to death camps in Poland, that it was no longer a rumor. Evidence was clear and the information was out there, but not out there for the public. Only for the government were they now acknowledging that there were death camps and things like that in the existence, but the public was still not quite aware of it. Of course, during this entire time, the slaughter is continuing. Even within this year of ignoring it, you have to understand that those countries were making an unconscious decision of letting another 1.5 million Jews suffer and perish before finding safety. Other kind of initiatives, the War Refugee Board, President Roosevelt began to respond to the reports of Jewish genocide. He officially started calling it by name and started to work with the Red Cross to try to save thousands of Eastern European Jews. Lastly, the Allied troops, when they finally do reach the camps in 1945, do see with their very own eyes this camp and the mechanisms that were created and the conditions of who's left. Some of these people don't necessarily resemble humans, as they've deteriorated and fallen apart by malnourishment and disease, that these people are in bad condition. I think perhaps one of the saddest things is that when these Allied troops go through, they witness these warehouses full of human hair. They go through these warehouses full of jewelry that the Nazis stole. They go through these crematories where there's full of ash from people who were burned as they were being burned to death, poisoned to death, or worked to death. One last thing I think is sad is that these Allied troops were so desperate to help these people that they would even try to give them treatment right there on the spot, like food and water. But unfortunately, these Jewish prisoners' bodies could not handle taking that huge influx of water and food. So even when the Allied powers desperately tried to help them, here's water, here's food, they were still dying because their bodies couldn't handle it. So more even died, even with the response of the Allied troops. Now, this next video is quite graphical, but this is a replication of what it must have been like to be that American troop, that soldier, going through Europe and discovering this foreign thing. Don't know about it, but here it is with all these people, and now you are their savior. Watch this video with me. I appreciate you guys going through that video, and if you got a lot of the emotions, I did too. Even me knowing this history, I still get emotional when watching those reactions because it's so human, that pain and trauma. And it hurts me to watch it, and hopefully you guys are able to get through it too.
So let's look at the impact of the Holocaust. So the liberation, when the Allied troops get there, most of the prisoners were released were in critical condition because of a typhus epidemic. More than 10,000 prisoners died within a few weeks of the liberation. So you imagine that, you're stuck in that cage and you're like, yes, I'm out of here, but you're already dying. And like Mr. Martinez said earlier, it's because of that malnutrition. So what was the outcome? The Nazis deliberately set out to destroy the Jews for no reason other than their religious and ethnic heritage. Today, the record of that slaughter is a vivid reminder of the monstrous results of racism and intolerance. So the exact number of deaths can never be known due to the Nazis' documents being destroyed and whole families being lost. What happened to the Jewish refugees? Well, survivors often had nowhere to go in Europe. Their homes, their villages, their communities, everything was destroyed. They still faced discrimination. However, many countries refused to accept them. So even that they had gone through all this, other countries were still refusing to accept them. Many were children or young adults without families who relocated to countries who were willing to help. The United States, next year, you guys will learn about the huge influx of Jewish people coming to the United States. The creation of Israeli territory. So the Jewish leader, David Ben-Gurion, he proclaimed the establishment of the state of Israel in the former British Palestine, the British Palestine Mandate. And this is like a Jewish kingdom. It's just a place where everywhere in Israel where you go and it's predominantly Jewish people. Many of them were displaced because they're Holocaust survivors. So if you look at this chart on the right, how many Jewish people were killed? 6 million. Soviet civilians, 7 million. You guys can look at the total number of Holocaust deaths, 15,933,000. We can easily say it was 16 or 17 million because we know that documents were destroyed. In context, all right, if we're talking about 15, 16, 17 million people dying, our Madera, California, we have 64,000 people here. Fresno has 525,000 and LA has 10 million. So, I mean, Madera would be killed over and over and over and over and over and over and over to get to that number. And this is why we never forget it, and this is why we're learning about it today.
That's right. I think it's weird because us humans, when we see numbers, it's easy for us to disassociate with how many actual people that number represent, right? How many people who existed, every person who thought of themselves as a universe of their own, every one of those people were real. So yes, that's a number, 15.9 million people who died in these camps. But when you start to look at our cities, it is crazy to think that, wow, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people.
So quick checkpoint, what was the outcome of the Holocaust? What was the outcome of the Holocaust?
Now, let's talk about what happens after the liberation of the camps. Where's the justice, right? Not all Nazis committed suicide like Hitler. Some were captured, and many needed to face what were the actions they did. And who is the person to be deemed the criminal or the guilty party? Is it the government who told the German Nazi to kill Jews? Is it the German guy who decided to kill Jews because the government told him? It's a very mixed issue, right? And that's what comes next, the Nuremberg trials, in which they try to find out with all captured Nazis, both the grunt private soldiers, to the prisoner guards, to the higher ups on top who came up with the idea. Who is to be found guilty for such a crime? Well, the Nuremberg trials happened in 1945 to 1949, and it was held worldwide. This was a world trial held by the United Nations, and there were a series of 13 trials. The defendants were relatively people who were in the Nazi party, like I said, officers of high ranking and even lower ranking, and even Nazi businessmen, people who supported the Nazi party, maybe didn't pull the trigger, but they gave the money. They supported the system. Those people also had to be put on trial. The loyalists, the lawyers, the doctors, everyone who was involved. Unfortunately, the Nazi leader himself, Adolf Hitler, did not find himself in these trials as he took the coward way out. So you start to see justice is being brought down during these Nurembergs. There's a lot of different laws and charters that are created along the ideas of how do we stop such a thing to ever happen again. These crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity now became an official crime within the worldwide audience. So people can now be put to trial for such injustices, even if it was other countries. Now, something else that was kind of interesting was German citizens' involvement. So the Allied powers started to realize that some German societies weren't aware of these death camps, and other societies, German societies, were aware but just didn't care. They were fine with it because they believed in the hate. So the Allied troops, when trying to clear out these camps of all the dead bodies and what's going on, they forced local German towns, their civilians, forced them to come to the camp and to clean up the bodies in which were put, that were there on the camps. A lot of these cities where people were forced to witness the actions that took place in their backyard. Let's go ahead and watch a video about the Nuremberg trials and how it went down.
It's 1945. October 2016 marks 70 years since Nazi.
All right, thank you for watching that video. Here's a checkpoint for you.
What was the purpose of the Nuremberg trials? Again, what was the purpose of the Nuremberg trials?
Awesome. Thank you so much for responding to that, folks. One last thing, or a few last things that we need to note on this. This history is very relevant for two potential reasons. One is something called Holocaust denial. As time has gone by, there are people who attempt to negate or minimize what actually happened in history. There's a group of people out there who believe that the Holocaust never happened. It was fake. It was all a hoax. That Jewish people essentially came up with this whole pretend thing in order to get power. Some people genuinely believe that, despite the fact of the physical evidence in which we see of both the camps and the absence of 15 million people in that time of history. So the Holocaust denial is a thing that we are noticing later in the development of history, as a lot of people are trying to minimize what happened here. And you're going to notice the people who are pushing such things are a movement of people who are relatively anti-Semitic. Neo-Nazis, the KKK, white supremacists. These individuals are the ones who still have a negative, hateful relationship with Jewish communities and are the people at the forefront of Holocaust denial, saying it is a lie. Neo-Nazis, if you don't know what that word is, it just means new Nazis. Unfortunately, in human history, we do not see the end of Nazi ideology end with the guy who created it. It still exists as of today. And you will notice that it has spread into other parts of countries, a lot of different groups of people who have white supremacy, nationalistic perspectives. And that is where we're starting to see why this is so important. When we start to see people forget the lesson or try to change the lesson in order of their own interests, we see a great threat to that. And of course, we do know the existence of hate crime and hate speech is still relevant as of today in our modern world. But ladies and gentlemen, that is officially the end of this history talk. You now understand what the Holocaust was, its development from becoming just hate to policy to legal hate, and to the final solution in its aftermath. We also got to see some of the justice that came with it with the Nuremberg trials and why this topic is still relevant to today. I really hope you guys had a great opportunity to learn a lot of new things from this and take in this information, as it is still a very important lesson, one that as a human society, we cannot forget. But far as today goes, folks, that is the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for going through this and finish up the note-taking that comes with today's assignment. But that's it for me. I'm Mr. Martinez.
Mr. Santiago here.
And we are signing out, folks. Thank you so much for being here.